plenty of time to, oh, okay, we got to hit the little agree to record. Ashley is a forensic biologist and supervisor for the Indiana State Police Laboratory in Indianapolis. In 2020, she was selected as the Forensic Scientist of the Year for the Indiana State Police. She conducts casework in seriology, DNA, blood stain pattern interpretation, which actually played a part in my second novel. She's been with ISPA or ISP for 14 years, and prior to that worked at the Utah State Crime Laboratory for 2 years. She was a member of the crime scene response team in Utah. She has completed more than 1,000 cases and testified more than 40 times in court. So it is a pleasure. Very excited to have you with us, Ashley. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It's your show.
Great. Thank you. I'm very excited to be able to share with you guys today. And I looked up on your website and learned a little bit about the group. And I just think all of it is really cool that you guys have this going on. So I am very excited to share with you. Can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Anybody? Yes. Okay. And then I'm also at my daughter's dance studio right now, so hopefully it won't get too crazy, but someone may pop in here or there and we'll just try and move on without too much distraction. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you guys today about forensic biology, hopefully giving you a little bit of background so that you can use it in your writing, and also throw in little tidbits here and there about things that I often see wrong in books or in like TV shows and movies, so that you can present that information properly. So again, he shared a little bit about myself. Sorry, I'm trying to be able to see my screen. There we go. So I graduated in 2006 from Loyola Marymount University. And then, like you said, I was at the Utah State Bureau of Forensic Services in 2006, where I did casework, and then also we had a crime scene response team there. I'm not going to talk too much about that today because it's been quite some time since I've done it, but I am going to give you contact information at the end. Feel free to contact me about any of the stuff that we talk about today, and I will either answer it myself or I can put you in touch with someone that can answer your specific question. I went to the the Indiana State Police Laboratory then in September of 2008, where I've been there ever since. I have been doing casework in serology and DNA analysis since that time, and then began casework in bloodstain pattern interpretation in 2015. And then I'm currently actively working on my master's in forensic biology and should be done next May. So I'm pretty excited about that. I am certified by the American Board of Criminalistics. There is no requirement for forensic analysts to have certification, but it is strongly encouraged, so many of us are. I'm also a member of professional organizations. These are the two that I'm active members in, and are also, if you look up their websites, they also often post a lot of really good resources and education material relating to those specific areas of forensics. And then the other thing is I just love what I do. I love doing these kinds of talks and things like that because I love to share what we do and kind of, let the general public know kind of what's going on behind the scenes. One thing I really love about the forensic community in particular when it comes to sciences, and a lot of the sciences, it's really cutthroat and people are competing with each other to get papers published or find some new, medicine or whatever. It's really cutthroat and competitive. The forensic community in general is very cooperative. We all across the country share information all the time. It's really this collective goal of doing the best that we can to help people within the criminal justice system. So it's just a really kind and welcoming community to be a part of, where we're all just trying to put some good in the world. So as far as educational requirements, which I'm just going to touch on this pretty briefly, because you probably don't care that much, but this is one thing that kind of can sometimes get misconstrued in writing or in TV shows and stuff. To be a DNA analyst, you really only have to have a bachelor's degree in what's considered a hard science. So biology, chemistry, that sort of thing. There are 4 undergraduate courses that you have to have taken. Other than that, there's no other requirements as far as education to do DNA casework. Each laboratory has to have a technical leader, which is kind of the person, they're the last decision when issues come up. They make the final technical decision, and they are required to have a master's degree. But other than that, you're mostly going to run into people with bachelor's degree and maybe master's degrees. So a lot of times in books and TV and stuff like that, they'll want to make these analysts doctors so-and-so. And that's just really something rare that you're going to find in the general community. When I first began back in 2006, it was right before kind of the huge wave of interest, but it was also when laboratory needs increased a lot with advances in DNA analysis. So many of us from back in the early 2000s only have bachelor's degrees. Now there's more individuals that are coming in with master's degrees simply because we get so many applications at this point. It's kind of an easy way to pare that down a little bit, is if we give preference to people with master's degrees. I think we've only ever had 2 people with PhDs that have come to work for the lab, and they did not last very long. It just wasn't for them. It's just, again, a different kind of environment than most people with PhDs are interested in dealing with. So, and then a little bit about the laboratory. We've been continuously accredited since 1991, and that's our accrediting body that you see there. It's an acronym within an acronym. And it is a voluntary process that laboratories don't have to choose to do, but there is federal funding that is tied to it. But where this might be important to you is that private laboratories or like defense experts that are hired, they have no requirement to be accredited or personally certified. A lot of times the defense experts are the ones that are doctors. They tend to be in academia, professors and such, that are coming in as, they call it defense experts, but they oftentimes haven't actually worked in the field and done actual casework. So sometimes there can be a little disconnect between the way that they would approach things versus the way that we do it actually in the laboratory. We have 4 regional laboratories in Indiana. The 4 colors you see there on the screen, those are the counties that contribute to each of the laboratories. It is free for any agency in the state of Indiana from submission of the evidence through our testimony. We do not charge anything as a state-run laboratory. Again, there are private laboratories and other experts that have their own systems, and they, if an agency were to send evidence to them, they would get a hefty fee, but they are available to do that. These are the services that we provide at our laboratories. Not all of them are at each regional laboratory, but across the state, we offer all of these. So we have the biology section, which I'm a part of, latent prints, which is all your fingerprint analysis, trace, which is things like matching duct tape tears, to fiber comparisons, and then they also do footwear comparisons and trace. There's the drug unit, which is all the identification of drugs that come into the laboratory. Question documents, they do things like forged checks, robbery notes, comparing handwriting to connect robbery notes. Firearms, which does the comparison of bullets and casings back to individual firearms. And then we also have crime scene investigation under our umbrella of the laboratory, but those are all sworn personnel. They are state troopers, whereas all of the people in the laboratory are civilian employees. In 2021, we did almost 26,000 cases. That's how many were submitted to the laboratory across all of the different units. For biology, we had 4,290 submitted. We have 181 employees across the state, and 57 of those are biologists. So even though we don't do the bulk of the cases necessarily, the time commitment it takes to do a DNA case tends to be a lot greater than many of the other disciplines. So we need more people in order to do the amount of casework that we get in. So these are kind of just a general list of the types of cases we get in the biology unit. Obviously, you get your homicides, sexual assaults. Probably the bulk of the cases that we get currently tend to be burglaries or property crimes. We also do unidentified human remains. We work with finding missing persons. And then we do criminal paternity. So we don't do the just general kind of who's your daddy situation, but if there was a crime committed in the process of conception, then we can do paternity in those situations. This is not an exhaustive list. We get a lot of kind of random one-off things. We pretty much will take anything where a crime has been committed and there's a potential for DNA to be of use in the case. So the first step in the biology unit is called serology, and this is the identification of body fluids. Traditional serology uses chemical testing and microscopy to characterize specific stains. So that would be when you are specifically trying to identify blood or semen. And back before DNA testing, cases could hang just on that. That would be all of the information that we would provide, and it could be potentially very useful for the case. Now with DNA analysis, not only can we test more types of samples, but we can also give more information, obviously, about who the DNA came from. So now when people talk about serology, it's more just a general term for screening an item of evidence for potential sources of DNA. So again, that can be things like blood, semen, saliva, but then we also do DNA testing on skin cells from people touching or handling items. We can do hair, bones, teeth, tissue, anything that has nuclear DNA, we can do DNA testing on it. So locating those areas is all now considered part of serology, even if we're not identifying a specific type of stain. So I'm just going to go through the testing that we do at the Indiana State Police Laboratory for each of these different substances. This is one thing too that I see a lot, mostly in movies or TV, where they kind of mix up the tests and the color changes and stuff that happen. So you can always come back to this and see specifically what tests for what type of stain. The first thing we do are called presumptive tests. They're very quick, they're very cheap. They are portable, so a lot of times our crime scene response team will carry these chemicals with them so that they can test things at the scene to determine whether or not they need to collect them to send into the laboratory. There's the reason they're presumptive tests is because there can be false positives that are in the environment. So it's mostly used as a screening to determine which samples are negative so that we don't have to waste time doing further testing on those particular stains. So for blood, the presumptive test that we use is called the phenolphthalein or the Kastle-Meyer test. It's the same test, just depending on where you are in the country, you probably call it something different. The false positives for that test are vegetable peroxidases, so horseradish. That honestly isn't seen very often in crime scenes. So we as analysts in the laboratory kind of think of this as a really good test. If we get a positive, we're usually pretty certain it's blood, but we can't actually say that unless we do a confirmatory testing. So if you look at the picture there, that bright pink color is the color that you will get when you add two chemicals to a stain of interest, and it's positive, it will turn that hot pink color. Another one that's used a lot, not so much in the laboratory, but it's used a lot in TV shows and movies, is luminol or Blue Star. Blue Star is a brand name of a luminol type reagent, whereas luminol is just like we can just make luminol in the laboratory. It's not a brand name. Again, it is portable. It's not as easy because you have to have complete darkness in order to see it, but it gives that glow that everyone really likes to see on TV. This is extremely sensitive, so it's really useful in situations where there's indication that maybe someone attempted to clean up after a bloodshed event. However, as you'll see in the false positives, bleach and other cleaners can also be a false positive. So it kind of is not necessarily super useful in that situation, but depending on what you see, it might give you an indication of at least where to begin to look for blood, and maybe use that phenolphthalein test that we discussed previously to hone in on areas where blood might be present. Then for blood, we have confirmatory testing. So the Takayama test, this has to be done in a laboratory. It tests for any kind of blood. It's not species specific. So sometimes we'll use this if there's like dog fighting, or there's a hit and run and someone's saying they hit a deer and not a person, where we might be testing for blood, but not specifically for human blood. So you add chemicals and heat, and then you view it under a microscope, and you get these kind of fluffy looking feathery crystals that are red under the microscope if it's positive. Then in our laboratory, we use what's called a heme direct. This confirms human blood specifically if we get a positive. It works a lot like a pregnancy test or a COVID test, where you have the control line and the test line. And if you have two lines, that means it's a positive. This is also extremely sensitive. The company that supplies these claims that it can be detected down to a 1 in 10 million dilution. So they are really, really sensitive and useful, but they're also much more expensive than our presumptive testing. So that's why we do those presumptive tests first, so that we don't waste time and money on samples that we already know to be negative. All right, so then for seminal material, which we obviously test for a lot in sexual assault cases, the first thing we do in the laboratory is a visual screening. So the seminal fluid fluoresces with ultraviolet light. So if you look down at the picture, there's some other fluids that fluoresce as well, but we can locate stains that we can't actually see with the naked eye. So we use what's called an alternate light source and put on special colored goggles. And then we're able to visualize these stains to determine where the best areas would be to test. So after we've located the stains, the first test that we do is, again, the presumptive test, and it's the acid phosphatase test. So this one is less helpful as far as false negatives or false positives, because as you'll see, vaginal secretions can give you a false positive, which if you're trying to find seminal material in a sexual assault case, that obviously is not super helpful if you have vaginal secretions that are also testing positive. Some feces and some foods can also cause false positives. So again, it's a good screening tool to determine what samples you want to investigate further, but it's not as specific as many of the other tests that we do. So then the confirmatory testing that we do actually confirms the presence of sperm cells, and we do that by visualizing them on an actual microscope. There's two different ways to do it. One is the phase contrast, which uses special light and filters in the microscope. And that's the top picture that you see there, where those sperm heads kind of glow, and then they have the dark colored tails. And then the other one that we have is called Christmas tree staining, and that stains the heads bright red. And then it's hard to see it in that picture there, but any other cells will be green. Hence the name, the Christmas tree stain, is simply because of the colors of the staining. Semen can still be present on the sample, even if we aren't seeing sperm cells. So even though this is a confirmatory test, it doesn't mean if we don't see it that semen isn't present. Situations where there's a vasectomy or just generally a low sperm count might end up that we don't see actual sperm cells under the microscope. We also do hair examinations, but we do not compare hairs to determine who they came from. Over the years, there have been a lot of mistakes and cases that have been overturned based on traditional hair analysis, where they would look under a microscope and say that two hairs came from the same person. We do not do that at all. We do look at them under the microscope, but we use it to determine if it's a hair or if it's a fiber. If it's a hair, we determine whether it's human or not human. And then if it's human, we just look and see if there is a root present for DNA analysis. So as you look at those different hairs down along the bottom, you can see, like, for example, the mouse looks quite a bit different than the human hair. So there's specific areas that we can look at in the morphology of the hair to determine whether or not it's potentially a human hair. There's some less common tests that are out there. None of these are done at our laboratory, but they are available at others. The amylase test, we actually used to do quite a bit. It was kind of a test for saliva, but it is present in food. It is present in anything from your digestive tract. So it wasn't a very specific test. And that's what you see, those blue circles. We would take a Petri dish with basically sugar in it and add the sample to it, and the amylase would break down the sugar. And then we could dye it with iodine. And if there was sugar present, it turns that kind of blue color. And then we would just measure the amount of clearing at each sample to determine whether or not saliva might be present. It is in really high concentrations in saliva, so sometimes it was a good indication. But it really brought up more questions than answers when it came time for court. And regardless of the size of that clearing, we would probably do DNA analysis on it anyway. So it just was not providing much information and causing more headaches. So we stopped doing that a few years ago.
Ashley,
Yes.
Ashley, this is Steve Terrell. If I could go back in your previous talking about hair.
Yes.
If you do not have a root on the hair, then you cannot do DNA analysis.
Correct. So there is mitochondrial DNA analysis, which we'll talk about a little bit later. That can be done potentially on the hair shaft, but traditional DNA analysis cannot be done without an actual root on the hair.
Thank you. Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah. Okay, so, and then there's tests for fecal material and urine that are out there as well. I did them years and years ago in Utah. I don't know how much they are in the community anymore, but we don't do it at the state police in Indiana. And then, like I said, now we're testing for skin cells. You can also hear them called epithelial cells or touch DNA. This honestly is probably what we get the most of these days, are samples like this. So we collect or swab areas that might have been touched. So anytime a person comes in contact with something, they have the potential to leave behind skin cells from the friction. So this is things like fingernail scrapings, ligatures, like handles of knives used in homicides, door handles, steering wheels. All those sorts of things are just looking for skin cells. And since there's no way to visualize those actual stains because they don't leave a stain behind, we just kind of collect blindly and take it straight to DNA and see if we recovered DNA at that point. Okay, are there any more questions on like the serology portion before I move forward with DNA?
Ashley, my name is Elaine, and can you tell us how you collect that touch DNA?
Sure. So typically, what we do is wet a cotton swab. We have like sterile, scientific cotton swabs, but they're really just like expensive Q-tips, but they are made to be sure that there's no DNA or other contaminants on the swab. We just add a little bit of water to it to get it moist, and then just scrub the areas that we think there may be a potential for skin cells there. And it will pick it up on that swab, and then we use that swab to continue on with DNA analysis.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions on that? We'll do questions again at the end too, if you think of something, but if anyone has a question right now before I move on, we can do that, or I can keep going.
How often do those come up positive? How often do you find something?
On the skin cell swab?
Yes.
Very frequently. Our testing now is really sensitive. So I would kind of stabbing in the dark here a little bit, just anecdotally, I would say that at least half the time I get DNA on those. Sometimes, like, for example, if it's like a doorknob swab at like a gas station, we're probably going to have so many individuals on that swab that I can't do anything with the data that's there, but I probably collected enough cellular material to develop a DNA profile.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good. Okay, I will keep going. So then after we do serology and determine what areas we want to test for the potential of DNA, we move on to the DNA portion. So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is considered the blueprint of life, is what people often say. It basically gives the instructions on how to make a human, and a very specific human. It's the basis of heredity. So you get half of it from your mother and half of it from your father. It is located in most human cells, but there is no nucleus in red blood cells. So when we're testing for DNA in blood, we actually aren't doing anything with the red blood cells. We're testing for only the white blood cells. So if someone has, like, for example, late stage AIDS, where they have a really reduced white blood cell count, it's actually really difficult to get a DNA profile from their blood, even though you might have a giant stain there. We just don't have enough of the right type of cell in the blood to get the DNA. We use it in forensics because it's variable. It's unique, except for identical twins will have the exact same DNA profile. It is the same throughout your body, and it is the same throughout your life. There we go. Okay. So the type of testing that we do in traditional DNA analysis for forensics is called short tandem repeats. So they're actually repetitive short segments of DNA. And the profile ends up being a series of numbers. A lot of times when I'm in court, I talk about it kind of being akin to a social security number, where at each specific location that I'm looking at, there's a limited amount of numbers that are available at that location. However, when we do a lot of locations together, the combination of those numbers makes it extremely unique. The only regions that we look at for forensics are non-coding regions. So there's no way for me to tell in traditional DNA analysis what color someone's hair is, what color their skin or eyes are. None of that information is in these short tandem repeats. There are some private laboratories that are doing this kind of phenotyping DNA analysis, where they're giving you some information on what the person might look like. But again, that's very specialized, and at very few labs right now. It's pretty new technology. So this picture down here at the bottom is just kind of a schematic of, I was trying to find the pointer, hold on. Here we go. So down here, so this would be a particular location. We'd have this repeat of the same 4 letters over and over again. And this would correspond to a 5 in the DNA profile because it's repeated 5 times. Below it would be 4, and below that would be 3. So to just quickly go through kind of the steps in developing a profile, we have the starting sample that, again, here you can see I'm collecting it on a swab. We extract the DNA, which is, we put chemicals on the cells to break them open and release the DNA, and then kind of get all of that extra cellular debris away and just have the DNA left. There's 2 different types of extractions that can be done. There's what we call a regular extraction, which is what we use for anything other than something that has sperm cells in it. So blood, skin cells, saliva, all of those things get the exact same type of extraction. If we suspect that semen might be present, we can do a specialized extraction that splits the single sample into 2 separate DNA samples, one which hopefully contains the DNA just from the sperm cells, and the other one contains DNA from any other type of cell. We then do what's called quantitation and determine how much human DNA we recovered in that sample and if there's enough there to move forward with analysis. Based on that, we do what's called amplification, and that is just making millions of copies of the specific areas of those STRs that we're interested in looking at to develop a DNA profile. We then can visualize that DNA profile through electrophoresis, and that's a really scrunched down small version of what we look at, but that that's the type of data that we get back off the instrument. And then an analyst does the interpretation, comparison, and statistical analysis. So this is a little bit bigger picture of what we see when we visualize the actual DNA profile. And there's 2 different types of DNA profiles we can get. One, we refer to as single source. And if you'll see up here at the top, these boxes with the kind of D, then a number names, those are called, we call them a locus or a loci for plural. And those are the names of the specific areas of the DNA that we're looking at. And then for each of those areas of DNA, we can have 2 pieces of information. So again, you get half from your mother and half from your father, and that's what this represents. So this particular person could have gotten the 15 from their mother and the 16 from their father. And we refer to these specific numbers as alleles. So alleles are the individual numbers that are located at each of the loci that we look at. And as you see here, in some situations, you have 1 peak, but it's quite a bit taller than these over here. And that's because this individual received the 10 allele from the mother and from the father. So it's roughly double the height, but so it's still 2 pieces of information, even though it's 1 number. Then what we can get is called a mixture. And that's when we have more than 2 pieces of information at each locus, which indicates more than 1 person contributed to that stain. So as you see here, like for example, THO1, we've got 4 numbers here, meaning that at least 2 people had to have contributed to this sample because each of them would have only had 2 numbers by themselves. So this is a very short DNA profile, just to give you an idea of how we compare it. So from those electropherograms, we then have this series of numbers where we have 1 or 2 number at each location, representing what we saw on the charts. And then we can develop a DNA profile from known individuals, and we call those standards. So if there is a suspect that is in the case, the investigating officer goes and collects a swab from the inside of their cheek to collect their DNA, so we can develop their DNA profile to compare to any unknown evidence profiles. So in this case, you've got suspect 1, and as you see, if you go down at each of the locations, they have the exact same numbers as the evidence profile. So you would include that person as a potential donor of the evidence DNA. Then if you had a second suspect, as you can see, those numbers in red are ones that do not totally match up with the evidence profile. And so in that situation, you would say suspect 2 could not have contributed to the evidence. So I'm going to touch briefly on statistics. Again, this is something that I see done wrong frequently, but I also know it's super boring and can kind of feel overwhelming. But just to give you a little bit of basis for the statistics that we provide, there's 2 main types of statistics that you'll see typically. About 10 years or so ago, this random match probability was kind of the bread and butter of forensic statistics. This was what we would provide most of the time. And it just uses the frequencies of the specific alleles to determine how likely you are to find a random unrelated person that has the same profile as the evidence. So the way that we would report that is the DNA profile is expected to occur once in X number of unrelated individuals. So where I see this one often go wrong is I'll hear people report, oh, it was only a 1 in a million chance that it was somebody else. And that's not exactly what it's saying. It's kind of independent. The statistic is dependent from the suspect. So it is just the probability that you would find that particular DNA profile if you pick someone at random. It happens to be the profile that's on the evidence, and you happen to have picked the individual that matches it. But it's not a direct correlation saying it's that many times more likely that it wasn't that individual. For this type of statistic, it was typically we would get numbers into the quadrillions, which is about 15 zeros, which is really great until you hear what we get now. So this is the easiest statistic to probably communicate. However, it is not the most impressive when it comes to the numbers. So what we report now is called a likelihood ratio. And it's a comparison of 2 different explanations of the data, and then a calculation of the likelihood of observing that evidence profile if a particular individual is a contributor. So the way that I like to explain kind of how we get to this likelihood ratio is if you have a chocolate chip cookie and you're trying to reverse engineer the recipe. So your evidence profile is akin to the final chocolate chip cookie, and then you're testing specific ingredients to see if they could have been in that original recipe. So if you were to try to make a chocolate chip cookie and you used chocolate chips as an ingredient, and you tested that against getting a chocolate chip cookie, if you used raisins as an ingredient, you'd be much more likely to get a chocolate chip cookie using chocolate chips rather than raisins. And that's kind of what we're doing here. So we have the evidence profile, we're comparing specific people to it and saying, how likely am I to observe this evidence profile if this particular individual was part of that DNA? So the way that that's worded is the DNA profile is number of times more likely if it originated from the suspect than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual. So for this particular statistic, it is not surprising at all to get numbers with 50 plus zeros. The likelihood ratios range from 0 to infinity. And I'm not kidding, like there's numbers where I'm like, I don't even know how we know what this is called because it is such a large number. So we actually cut off our reporting in our reports at 1 trillion, just because we figure most people have at least heard that number. So if it's anything over than 1 trillion, we'll report that the number is at least 1 trillion times more likely. And then we also, since it's kind of a number and a statistic that people aren't used to dealing with, we have up in the corner up here, this is our verbal scale. So when you get an LR between 100 and 10,000, that's only moderate support for that individual being a contributor. We do this because kind of if the average person heard this DNA profile is 10 times more likely if it originated from the suspect than if it was somebody else. That might sound, just talking in general, that 10 times more likely, that sounds pretty good. But actually that when you put it on the scale of the numbers that we're getting, it's actually a really poor statistic. So we offer this additional verbal qualifier to kind of give an understanding of where that number falls on the scale. So once we get over 1 million for our likelihood ratio, then we consider that very strong support for that individual being a contributor to the DNA. And so, like I said, the random match probability tends to be a little bit easier to convey, and this is why. With the likelihood ratio, it's really easy to misinterpret the results when you summarize it. So what happens is that we'll state the DNA profile is at least 1 trillion times more likely if it originated from the suspect than from an unknown person. And someone wants to come back and say, so the probability that someone other than the suspect contributed to this profile is 1 in a trillion. And what that is done is changed it from a probability of the results given the proposition to the probability of a proposition. And I know this probably just doesn't make sense. So I've got this little way to kind of explain exactly what I'm saying in that situation. So if you say there's a very high probability that an animal would have 4 legs if it's an elephant, right? So the probability of 4 legs, given it's an elephant, very high. I think we can all agree on that. And that would be like coming back and saying, therefore, it's a very high probability that if an animal that an animal is an elephant if it has 4 legs. And obviously we know there's plenty of animals that are not elephants that have 4 legs. So it doesn't switch in that way. And then I'm just going to talk briefly about the database system, what we call CODIS. It stands for the Combined DNA Index System, and it's a database of DNA profiles. Our national database is maintained by the FBI, and anything that we submit to the database has very specific rules about whether or not it can go in. The common things that we put in are profiles from evidence, and then they also collect those DNA standards from convicted offenders, and that can go in the database as well to compare to the evidence profiles. There's also separate areas within the database that are for unidentified remains, missing people, or relatives of missing people. So any profiles that are in those areas of the database are not checked against evidence profiles. So if you had a relative go missing and you wanted to supply your DNA to help identify them if remains were found, you would not have to worry about your DNA profile being compared to evidence profiles and potentially getting in trouble for something. So you can submit that knowing that it's not going to potentially come back to bite you. Those are completely separate areas of the database. So there's 2 ways that we use this in forensics when it comes to crimes. It can make a connection between an offender and a case, or it can connect together serial cases. So those evidence profiles are checked against each other. And a lot of times that's how they identify serial rapists, is that those cases will hit to each other because they have the same DNA profile. So this is kind of the end of the traditional DNA analysis. So I thought I'd just share a quick case study. This was my actual case and kind of uses most of the traditional DNA that we've talked about. So in September of 2016, there was a masked man that was entering unlocked homes in and around IU. He was going into women's bedrooms and attempting to rape them. A lot of the women, if they woke up and yelled, he would quickly run out. He would get spooked off. There were 3 in one Thursday night and then another the following Monday. And because of the mask and things that the survivors would say that the individual stated and the interactions they had with them, Police thought they may be connected, but they were also not sure that one person could have gotten to all three of those different locations on that Thursday night. So they rushed DNA evidence to the laboratory and asked for it to get immediately processed so that they could get a profile into CODIS, since this was clearly going to be an ongoing and immediate threat. There was one case where the woman was raped. I found the skin cells on a drinking cup that was submitted. I guess he had filled the cup with water and told her to dump it on her or something like that. There was some reason he touched this drinking cup. So I found his DNA on the drinking cup, and then there was also semen found on the survivor. So I was able to put that DNA profile into CODIS, and we got a hit. Devin Grounds was confronted by police, and he admitted to the rape that we had his DNA profile from that was in CODIS, but he denied all of the other break-ins and attempted rapes. So then I was able to work through the evidence in those other cases, and I found his DNA profile on the bedroom doorknob from another break-in. It was actually a mixture of Devin Grounds and the victim's boyfriend on the doorknob. So when they presented him with the fact that we had his DNA at least one other scene, he confessed to all of them and was sentenced to 30 years. There's a few other less common types of DNA analysis that we work on. So there's YSTR analysis, which only looks at areas on the Y chromosome. This is used in cases where there's an excess of female DNA. It can hone in specifically on the male DNA. Any male in a paternal line will have the same profile. Mitochondrial DNA, again, this is what would be used on hairs without roots. Can be used when there isn't nuclear DNA available, and this is passed down through maternal lines. So a mother and all of her children will have the same DNA profile. We said we can also do relationship testing to determine paternity. And we also use this to identify unknown remains by comparing back to family members of missing individuals. And then genealogy, which has obviously been in the news a lot lately, compares the DNA profiles to public genealogy databases and attempts to find relatives of the evidence profile. You need a lot more DNA, and it can't be a mixture, and it's very time consuming and expensive. So this can't be used in every case. It's very specific cases where this can be useful. And I just realized we're getting pretty close to 1 o'clock. Are we still good, or do I need to go faster?
Oh, we're still good.
Okay. So this is a case study for genealogy. This is a case in Indiana that everyone was very excited to solve. So April Marie Tinsley, she was an 8-year-old girl that was abducted from Fort Wayne in 1988. She was found a few days later, and the autopsy showed that she had been raped and strangled. So from that, they were able to get a DNA profile that was put into CODIS, but it sat for decades without a hit. So over the years between 1990 and 2004, there were several notes that had additional DNA evidence that matched the DNA evidence from the actual homicide that were left around the Fort Wayne area, and that was linked all to April's case. In 2018, they sent that sample out for genealogy testing. And by July, a genealogist had it narrowed down to 2 brothers. They pulled tracks from John Miller's residence and found that he was a match to all of the DNA evidence that had been left at the homicide scene and the additional notes over the years. On the 15th, they arrived at his residence. They asked him, "Do you know why we're here?" And he immediately said, "April Tinsley." He confessed to the kidnapping, the rape, and the murder. And in 2018, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison, which at this point, he's already pretty old. So he will definitely spend the rest of his life in prison for this. Okay, are there any questions on DNA analysis? I was going to move into bloodstain pattern interpretation for a bit, or we can save all the questions till the end, whatever works best.
I was wondering, this is Pamela, and I was wondering, we hear about a backlog in DNA analysis. In some places in the country, it goes back years. Labs are, just understaffed and badly backlogged through no fault of their own in many cases, I would imagine. But is that true, false?
Okay, so it depends on what you're talking about. So yes, we are understaffed and backlogged for sure. And COVID did not help the situation at all. So there is a backlog of cases, but a lot of times, especially what you're hearing in the news is referring specifically to sexual assault cases. I know, I can't remember her name, that's on Law and Order SVU, did a lot of work to get that information out about the backlog. And it tended to get blamed a lot on laboratories. They made it sound like these kits were sitting in laboratories waiting to be processed. But in that situation, what was actually happening is police agencies were not submitting to them to the laboratory. So they were actually sitting in storage at police agencies, and the laboratories didn't even know they existed. So once this information got out that these kits existed, laboratories actively solicited to get those in so that we could test them. We had several across the state of Utah that we didn't know existed, that had been sitting for a while. So then when those got submitted, that increased the actual laboratories backlog because, we usually say we got 300 sexual assault cases in a typical year, and instead we got 3,000. Those numbers aren't accurate and it's an exaggeration, but then that exacerbated our backlog problem because they weren't coming in steadily as they were happening like we thought they were. We all of a sudden just got dumped with all of the ones that they found throughout the state.
Does DNA degrade then if it's out there for some time?
It depends on how they were stored. Many of them we actually are getting really great results from. There are some that are in less than ideal storage conditions, and they would come in like they had clearly gotten wet. They might have mold growing on them. And sometimes we can still get DNA profiles from them. It just can be a little bit more difficult. But if the evidence was stored in a cool, dry place, then there's no reason we can't get a DNA profile decades after the fact.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else on that before I move on? Okay, so I'm just going to touch briefly on bloodstain pattern interpretation. It is using physics and math to determine how a bloodstain may have occurred. So the things that are typically answered by bloodstain interpretation is the location of people or objects, or movement of them within the scene, area of origin and convergence, which we'll talk a little bit about later, the minimum number of blows, the type of weapon, and potentially sequencing of events. So there are several different types of patterns that we look for. One that is kind of the bread and butter of pattern interpretation is called impact. So that's when blood is acted upon by an external force. We used to divide these into categories. So this would be like a low force situation. This would be what's called medium force, and this would be high force. So in low force, it would be just gravity acting on a blood drop. In medium force, that's what you would see in like beatings and stabbings, kind of the amount of force behind it that a human by itself could create. And then the high force would be things like gunshots or mechanical situations like machinery would cause these very, very small blood stains with this kind of misting effect. When we have impact stains, we can actually determine the angle of impact, which tells us the approximate angle that a blood drop hit a surface. So as you see, this droplet comes in and hits a surface, and then using trigonometry, we can determine what angle that it hit at. So we use the length of the stain, the width of the stain, apply this formula here, and it can tell us the angle that it hit. We can also do an area of convergence. So we actually draw lines through the individual stains in the direction that they're traveling. And where they all come together down here, this is called the area of convergence. And so that's in 2 dimensions, kind of where that bloodshed originated from. And then if we combine the impact angles with that area of convergence, we can actually pull these lines out in 3 dimensions and put a location in a room about where the incident took place. So a lot of times where this might come into play is in a situation where one person is saying, well, there's only one survivor and he's saying it's self-defense. If all of your blood stains or your impact stains originate really close to the floor, it kind of can disprove his statement a little bit in that that person was already on the ground. You didn't need to keep beating them. In that situation, it wouldn't be self-defense. So a lot of times placing it in the room like that is used for those types of cases where they're trying to look at homicide versus self-defense. We also have cast off. So when blood is flung off an object being swung, a lot of times we'll see this on walls and ceilings. And then another place we see it is down the back of an attacker's clothing as they are swinging it up over their shoulder. It can cast off down the back of their shirt and their pants. From this, we could potentially determine the minimum number of blows. So in this situation, you see kind of 3 main lines here. So it had to be at least 3 blows, often more. Usually we do the minimum number of lines that we see +1 because they had to hit an individual first to make blood start flowing before the blood could get on the item to cast off. So usually the first blow won't leave any cast off. And if they hit that individual again, that's when it puts the blood on the item. And then when it's swung back, it's flung onto the wall. This can also help place attackers and victims in a room. Could potentially give the handedness of an attacker. Like if it's on clothing, you can determine whether they swung it over their right shoulder or over their left shoulder. And then you can also potentially include or exclude types of weapons. Then we have what are called swipes, which is where you have a bloody object that comes into contact with something that's not bloody and leaves behind staining. In this case, these kind of swirly things, this is what happens when you have bloody hair come in contact with an item. It kind of gives this different kind of swirly pattern. A wipe is where you have a blood stain on an item and then you wipe through it, altering that. As you can see, you've got a little bit of drying here. So you know that was the original stain and then they wipe through it. And then we have pools and flow. So on this individual, you can see that there's many different directions that the blood is traveling. It's not just with gravity. So that can give an indication that this person moved or was moved while blood was flowing because it's not all going in the same gravitational direction. We have contact transfer patterns. These are your typical, fingerprints in blood, shoe prints in blood. This is the head of a hammer that's imprinted on a piece of cloth. Then you can have expirated, which looks a lot like impact sometimes, but that's actually when it's expelled out of an airway or it is coughed out. And then a void is actually an area without staining. So as you can see here, this almost looks like a foot or a shoe here where there's kind of this break in this main pattern, meaning something had to be blocking the blood from landing in that particular area. And then just a quick case study in spatter. I had a case in July of 2017. There was a fatal shooting between 2 friends near Ball State. The suspect told police that he thought his friend was holding a knife, but it turned out to be the knife sharpener that's pictured below. When I first opened this, I noticed that there's staining and spatter all around the handle. So there's no way that someone could have been holding that handle at the time that the blood was shed because their hand would have created a void in that pattern. I don't think spatter had a whole lot to do. There was a lot of other stuff in the case that was presented, but the jury did find him guilty of reckless homicide and he was sentenced to 8 years. All right, do we have any more questions? I also have, like I said, my contact information here. I'm happy to help with whatever, either email or phone, or I can get you in touch with someone that can help if it's something that's not in my expertise. But I'm happy to take any questions now if you guys have time.
Questions?
Actually, I I have a question about blood spatter. You kept you mentioned often about in a room. What if someone is outside and there's like it's pouring rain down? Is there any chance of blood being able to give you an indication of who might or might not have done it?
As far as blood spatter, not really. I mean, anytime it gets wet or altered in any way, then those patterns, you're not gonna be able to do an interpretation of them. You would still be able to do DNA in those situations, even if it had been rained on, as long as you can locate the patterns. But as far as determining how the patterns got there, unless they were protected from the rain in some way, you wouldn't be able to.
Okay, thanks.
Any more questions?
I have one more. It's Pamela again.
Yeah.
Can you tell the difference, or is this maybe something the medical examiner would do, between like somebody tripping and falling and hitting their head on something versus that something being hit on them? In other words,
Potentially, I guess it would depend on the situation. I think in that case, you could potentially use that area of origin. So if they tripped and fell and hit something that was on the floor, you would expect that impact spatter to have that area of origin down close to the floor. Whereas if they were standing up and someone hit them, it would create a different type of pattern up higher. But if it's between someone falling and hitting their head on the floor or on an object on the floor versus them being on the floor and someone hitting them, it would be really difficult to tell the difference between those two scenarios.
that's really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ashley, any more
Yeah.
questions?
Real quick, could we
Or-
see your contact information again?
Sure. Let's share this again.
Hi, Ashley. I do have one question.
Sure.
And again, this is something from a movie, so I have no idea if this is real or not, but does spraying ammonia on blood actually do anything? Like prevent a DNA sample or something like that?
It wouldn't prevent a DNA sample. We could still get DNA from it. It could be used to clean it up, so it might be harder to locate the staining. But if the
Okay.
staining could be located, we could still get DNA.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I have one last question, which is what, and I know this is maybe phrased the wrong way, but what's the coolest thing you've ever done as a forensic scientist? One thing you go, that was really cool, I could do that, or something like that.
I think honestly, the one that sticks out most to me was that Bloomington case that I mentioned earlier. We had just changed our interpretation guidelines for mixtures, and had that case happened even a year prior, I would not have been able to get his DNA profile on that door handle to connect him to the other break-ins. So it's kind of like, I don't know necessarily that's super exciting if you're not in it, but the fact that I was able to use that information on the door handle to put him at that scene just was really, really exciting to me.
Very cool. When you decide to go this direction, did the O.J. Simpson case have anything to do with it?
Not really, a little young. I think I was in 6th grade when that trial happened. So I didn't even really know that that was a thing at the time. But when I left for college, I started watching a whole lot of forensic files every night. And that's when I decided to kind of switch my direction and go this way.
Excellent, excellent. I think
Ashley?
there's one. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Ashley, this is Jennifer. I just had a quick question.
Sure.
Is there any way to clean up blood so that you will not find any DNA? So, you know, the suspects cleans really well with some chemical or something. What would be successful for doing that?
So there's not really any cleaning chemicals that necessarily like destroy the DNA. It's actually the removal of DNA. So anything would, even water would work if they were able to wipe up all of the cells. So things like alcohol and bleach tend to make the cells kind of looser on the surface, if you will. So they're easier to wipe away. But none of those are actually destroying the DNA in any way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ashley, I want to thank you so much. It was just an incredible program. It was just great. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this, for taking the time out of your day to do this, and for helping us out. It's been spectacular.
Yeah,
Thank
I'm
you.
so glad to do it. Thank you for having me. And like I said, I love sharing what I do. So don't hesitate to reach out. My contact information, I'll help with anything. So
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, that wraps up our program. And thanks for everybody for sticking around, and those who are not part of our chapter of Sisters in Crime and joining us today. We'll welcome you back anytime. So thank you very much. Have a great
Thanks,
weekend, everybody. Thanks again, Ashley. It was really spectacular.
Good. Thank you.